Hi, I'm Dr. Sarah Beth Wilson, and this is the story of how my stepbrother's arrogance taught him an expensive lesson about underestimating a country vet. Sometimes the person in muddy boots knows more than the one in the designer suit. Wilson Ranch wasn't just any cattle ranch, it was home to the most prestigious breeding program in Texas, with bloodlines worth millions. My grandfather started it, my father expanded it, and I dedicated my life to it, becoming a veterinarian specifically to care for our award-winning herd. Everything changed when Dad married Eleanor Peters 6 years ago. She came with a son, Michael, who had an MBA from Harvard and big plans to modernize our traditional operation. From day one, he saw our careful breeding program and individualized animal care as outdated and inefficient. "Sarah, darling," he'd say, checking stock reports on his phone while I performed ultrasounds on pregnant heifers. "You're thinking too small. We need to scale up, maximize profits. All this personal attention to the animals is cutting into our margins." What Michael failed to understand was that our reputation wasn't built on margins. It was built on producing the finest cattle in the country. Every rancher knew that a Wilson bloodline meant excellence. Our bulls regularly sold for 6 figures at auction, and our breeding contracts had a 3-year waiting list. But Michael only saw numbers on a spreadsheet. He started pushing Dad to embrace factory farming methods, to treat our operation like a commodity producer rather than the boutique breeding program it was. Dad, impressed by Michael's business degree and corporate swagger, began to listen. I tried to explain why mass production would destroy everything we built. "Our clients pay premium prices because they know how we care for our animals," I argued. "They're not buying bulk cattle. They're buying generations of careful breeding and individual attention." Michael would just roll his eyes. "That's why you're still playing doctor with the cows while I'm handling the actual business decisions." What they didn't know was that 5 years ago, when I finished veterinary school, my grandfather had set up a separate company in my name, Wilson Genetics LLC. Every valuable bloodline, every breeding contract, every prize-winning animal was registered under this entity. The farm only had a license to use and profit from these genetics as long as they maintained our traditional breeding standards. "Protect the bloodlines, Sarah," Grandpa had said before he passed. "They're your family's real legacy." The situation came to a head at last month's Texas Cattlemen's Association Awards dinner. Our prize bull, Storm Ruler, had just won Grand Champion, adding another $1 million to his breeding value. Michael saw dollar signs, but he didn't understand what made Storm Ruler special. The next morning, he convinced Dad to call a family meeting. "It's time for Wilson Ranch to enter the modern era," Michael announced, standing in our family room in his Italian suit, looking out of place among the worn leather furniture. "I've drawn up a modernization plan that will triple our production capacity." He laid out his vision, selling off our overvalued prize bulls, replacing them with quantity over quality, turning our carefully managed pastures into high-density feeding operations. "Dad has agreed to sign over controlling interest to me," Michael continued, smirking in my direction. "We need decisive leadership, not someone who spends all day playing vet with the animals." I watched as Dad signed the papers, Eleanor beaming beside him, 20 years of my life's work being handed over to someone who saw our animals as nothing but numbers on a balance sheet. "Don't worry, Sarah," Michael said condescendingly. "We'll still need a vet on staff as long as you learn to work more efficiently. No more of this individual care nonsense." I stood up quietly. "I'll need to check on Storm Ruler. He has a breeding collection scheduled for tomorrow." "Whatever," Michael waved his hand dismissively. "Just make sure all the paperwork is ready for when I take over next week. We've already got buyers lined up for some of these overpriced animals." I drove my truck out to Storm Ruler's pasture, where he grazed with his carefully selected herd. Pulling out my phone, I made a call I'd hoped I'd never have to make. "Dr. Roberts, it's Sarah Wilson. Remember that contingency plan we discussed? It's time." The next morning dawned bright and clear. Michael arrived early, ready for his first official day as the new head of Wilson Ranch. He had buyers coming to look at Storm Ruler, planning to sell our champion bull for quick cash. His new Range Rover kicked up dust as he drove to the main barn, already talking on his Bluetooth about modernization plans. He was so busy looking at his tablet that he didn't notice something odd. The pastures were empty. I sat in my clinic office, calmly drinking coffee, waiting for the storm to hit. "Sarah," Michael burst through my door, face red. "Where are the cattle?" Where's Storm Ruler? I looked up from my medical records. Oh, they're safe. Wilson Genetics LLC moved them to our new facility last night. Wilson what? What are you talking about? I pulled out a folder and slid it across my desk. 5 years ago, Grandpa created a separate company to protect our bloodlines. Every valuable animal on this farm, their genetics, offspring rights, breeding contracts, they're all owned by my company. The farm only had a license to use them as long as certain conditions were met. Michael snatched up the papers, his hands shaking. This is impossible. The farm owns the cattle. The farm owns some basic stock. I corrected him. But Storm Ruler, his entire breeding line, the embryos in our lab, the $1 million breeding contracts, they all belong to Wilson Genetics. Check the registration papers. The color drained from his face as he frantically flipped through documents. Every major asset he planned to sell was legally owned by my company. Dad, he shouted, pulling out his phone. We have a problem. Dad arrived 20 minutes later with Eleanor, and had already laid out all the documentation. Breeding registries, genetic patents, contract agreements, everything Grandpa and I had quietly put in place to protect our legacy. The farm only had a licensing agreement, I explained to Dad gently. It expired the moment you signed over control to someone planning to abandon our breeding standards. You underhanded little Eleanor began, but Michael cut her off, his business mind finally grasping the situation. How much? He demanded. How much to buy the genetics company? I smiled. It's not for sale. But I have a counter offer. I laid out my terms. I would lease the genetics and breeding rights back to the farm, but only under specific conditions. I would have full control over the breeding program. No mass production, no selling off bloodlines. We would maintain the standards that made Wilson cattle the best in the business. And if we refuse? Michael asked through gritted teeth. Then I take my company, my cattle, and my contracts elsewhere. The buyers you lined up, they're not paying premium prices for the farm, they're paying for our bloodlines. Without them, Wilson Ranch becomes just another commodity ranch. Dad sat heavily in a chair, looking suddenly old. Sarah, why didn't you tell me about this? Would you have listened, Dad? You were so impressed by Michael's modern business ideas, you forgot what made our farm special in the first place. The next few weeks were tense. Michael tried to fight it legally, but our documentation was ironclad. In the end, they had no choice but to accept my terms. Storm Ruler and the rest of our prize herd returned to their pastures. I took over the breeding program completely, while Michael focused on the farm's basic operations under my supervision. Last month at the National Cattle Show, we won 5 championships. Michael stood awkwardly at the celebration dinner as buyers praised our commitment to traditional breeding excellence. You planned this all along, didn't you? He asked later, watching me tend to a newborn calf. All those years of playing the simple farm vet. I wasn't playing anything, I replied, checking the calf's vitals. I was protecting our legacy. These aren't just assets on a spreadsheet, Michael. They're living creatures, and they're our responsibility. Yesterday, Dad came to my clinic, looking at my wall of veterinary degrees and breeding awards with new eyes. Your grandfather would be proud, he said softly. He always said you were the one who truly understood what we were building here. The farm continues to thrive, though differently than Michael had planned. He's learning slowly that some things can't be reduced to profit margins. Sometimes he even helps with the cows, though he still refuses to wear boots. Last week, a young farming student asked me why I didn't just take my cattle and start fresh somewhere else. I showed her Storm Ruler's newest calf, already showing his sire's championship potential. Because this land isn't just dirt and grass, I told her. It's generations of dreams, hard work, and dedication. Sometimes protecting a legacy means standing your ground, even if you have to be sneaky about it. Wilson Ranch remains a family operation, just with a clearer understanding of who really runs things. And if you look carefully at the new sign by our front gate, you'll notice something interesting. Wilson Ranch in proud partnership with Wilson Genetics LLC. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about winning. It's about preserving what matters, even if you have to outsmart a Harvard MBA to do it.